I don't know. Oh, man. If you've got a copy of God's Word, we're going to be in Mark chapter 15, and I'm excited. Anytime you preach through a book of the Bible, and it takes longer than 6 months, we in the final stretch, and I'm excited. We're going to wrap up Mark on Sunday. Pastor Steve and I will tag team during sunrise, the end of chapter 15, and then I will do Mark 16 during Easter. And so hopefully you've been able to keep up with your videos this week, with your reading guide as well as your devotional. I know it's been pretty neat. There are 9 churches that are using our devotional this year. And those are 9 churches in 3 states. So that's exciting that others are able to go through that with you. But if you're with us Sunday, we looked at the weight of the world from Mark chapter 14, verses 53 through 72. And I tried to spray a lot of Febreze, but it didn't work. So it still smells up here from all my shoes, if you remember from Sunday. But anyway, on Sunday I asked the question, what happens to Jesus after he was arrested? What does it mean for our lives? If you were here Sunday, we looked at bloodthirsty wolves and brutal truth that was written. This evening I want to talk to you for a few minutes on a sermon I've entitled, We Are Barabbas. We are Barabbas. You and I can see in this text tonight that we are Barabbas when we look at the silence, the substitution, and the striking that is found in this text. Many times, oftentimes, when I can't be here or when I'm away or whatever the case may be, Pastor Steve will take my place. He'll fill in the gap, right? Or maybe you can't be at work and something's got to be done and somebody takes your place and has to fill in the gap. You might be reminded that if you've ever seen the Disney movie Mulan, okay, and I've done a lot of research on Mulan because I'm a nerd and I'm weird, that's not a real story, okay? I found that out. It's based on folklore. But it is true that in Chinese history and Chinese tradition, that if the older man, let's say a man, only had daughters, and let's say he gets older, even if China were to go to war, that old man still has to go to war, right? Even if he's old. China was brutal. You might know and understand that the Great Wall of China, if you were to look at the very bottom of it, it is actually compacted with human bones and skulls. If somebody was dying and they were building the Great Wall, they just threw their body into the stones and then crushed it. And that has nothing to do with the sermon, but I just thought I'd give you that little tidbit. And so we know the story of Mulan, that Mulan takes her father's place, disguises herself as a man, and obviously she wasn't, and then she's exposed when she gets hurt in war, right? And they realize that she was a woman, but she didn't. She took her place. Why? Because she didn't want her father. She knew if her father, as an elderly man, were to go into battle, that it would be a death sentence for him. Having somebody take your place takes on an entire different meaning when life or death is involved. And here's something that we as a society do that we don't need to do. Some people mean it, most don't. Oh, I'd take a bullet for you. I'd die for you. I've heard people say that. Is it true? Would we really take somebody's place? Well, Jesus did. And we get to look at that and observe that this Holy Week. I want to ask you this question this evening. How does the releasing of Barabbas symbolize our own salvation story through the substitutionary atonement of Jesus? Number 1, you got to look at Jesus' silence. Look there at verses 1 through 5. First, at verse 1, as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And so we talked about Sunday how they were in the middle of the night and they were at the high priest's home, right? Peter's in the courtyard and everybody else is in there in the high priest's home in his house, and they are in the late hours of the night and they're doing this. Well, the next morning they get up and, hey, we're going to have another meeting. We know what we want to do, so let's do this thing and let's take him over to Pilate. Why the rush? Why are they so quick to want to get this done? Well, the religious leaders want to move quickly and get Jesus' case to Pilate. Why? Because they want Jesus executed before the Sabbath begins. Because once the Sabbath begins on Friday evening, when the sun sets, they can't do anything. Notice how the religious leaders pick and choose parts of God's word and law that they want to follow and others that they don't. Oh, we'll follow the Sabbath, but yeah, we're not going to follow some of these others, and you and I are the same way. But secondly, I want you to see there in verses 2 through 5, specifically in verse 1, I want you to look at Pilate's profile. Pilate's got a profile here. We need to look at who Pilate is. We've heard about who he is for a long time, at least for my entire life. I've heard about him, but who is this guy? Verse 1, and they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. I want to remind you, the Jews are under Roman control, right? They're under Rome. And so they can't execute somebody, but they can have the government do it. So they want to go through the government in order to have Jesus executed. So the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leaders, have already decided to convict Jesus of blasphemy. But they were going to present it to Pilate as he was king of the Jews, meaning they want in Pilate's mind for the way the religious leaders are presenting this is, hey, this guy is calling himself a king, so that means he's a threat to Caesar. So you need to kill him, right? And so manipulation is all over these religious leaders. Notice how crafty and manipulative people can be when they desperately want to have their way. The human heart can be so evil, crafty, and manipulative. The Roman government would be the ones to have to do the actual killing. And so this situation is now put on Pilate's plate. He's got to make the decision. And Pilate was the 5th Roman governor of Judea after the reign of King Archelaus in AD 6. You can see Matthew 2:22. Pilate held this position for 10 years, from AD 26 to AD 36, okay? And so he was appointed to this position by the emperor of Rome, who was Tiberius. You had to be appointed, so there's a whole political game here to become a governor. And so Pilate is the one who has to make these kind of decisions. Now, Josephus and Philo, both philosophers, Jewish philosophers, both required Pilate, wrote this about Pilate, saying he was cruel and without any sensitivity for Jewish religious beliefs or practices. And so there's a huge argument and a tension between the Roman people and Jewish people. They didn't like each other. And so, obviously, though, the Romans are over the Jews. And Luke 13, verse 1, tells us of an instance when Pilate messed with the Jews over a sacrifice issue. But the governors of the different sections of Rome, they all live in Caesarea at this time. But it is believed that Pilate was in Jerusalem. He was sent to Jerusalem because he had to calm the Jews down just in case they wanted to get loud and angry during Passover week. It was the job of the governor to calm the people down because Jewish protests were quite common. Now, isn't that a little ironic? That the Jewish people, who were God's chosen people, the Israelites, Jewish people, were known for causing riots and known for causing a ruckus and known for creating drama so much that when they have a religious church service, the emperor of Rome tells one of his governors, hey, you need to go oversee that to make sure they don't get out of hand because they cause a problem. Don't you find that ironic that the church people at the time were the ones causing the problem? Yeah, it does. But isn't that sad? That they had the reputation for creating problems. I don't want that to be our reputation. Not as a church, not as a believer. If you're a believer in Christ and somebody knows you as a troublemaker, blessed are the peacemakers. And so Jewish protests were common. So Pilate is we see the profile, we see who he is, but now he's got a predicament. Look at verses 2 through 5, Pilate's predicament. And Pilate asked him, talking about Jesus, he said, are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him, you have said so. Notice how he answers him. Verse 3, and the chief priest accused him of many things. And Pilate asked him, have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you? In verse 5, but Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Pilate has some very angry Jewish chief priests who want Jesus to be killed. But Pilate's predicament here is that he can't see what Jesus has done wrong. Pilate understands that Jesus hasn't done anything. He understands that. He sees that in this situation. And he's astounded by Jesus' silence here. All four gospel accounts, Matthew 27:11, Luke 23:3, and John 18:33, all record Pilate's response the exact same way, which is very interesting. Up until this point in Mark's gospel, the term King of the Jews has not appeared once. But it appears 3 times in our text tonight, 6 times total in Mark chapter 15. In verse 2, Pilate asked him, he said, "Hey, are you King of the Jews?" And notice, just like the high priest did back in Mark 14:61, that they make a Christological confession without realizing that they're doing it. They're ignorantly doing it, but they are making a Christological confession, which is what the high priest did, we looked at Sunday, in Mark 14:61. And look at Jesus' answer. Jesus answers in a way that it is not an affirmation, nor it is a denial. I think that Jesus may have been thinking at the time, yeah, I am a king, but I'm not just a king or any king. I am the king. But I'm not a king in the way that you're thinking I'm a king. So I'm just going to leave it with what you have said. And then he stays silent. In verse 3, Mark doesn't tell us the specific charges that were made. But Luke 23 verse 2 tells us the specific charges that were made. Luke 23:2, and they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar." That was a lie. And they wanted to tell that to Pilate. Oh, he's telling us not to give money to the government. You need to lock him away, take him away, and then saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Most people who knew that they were going to die would not have stood there silently and not defended themselves. Most people, if they know they're going to die, they're going to fight, they're going to squirm, they're going to scramble, they're going to do anything and everything they can do to try to get out of that situation alive. Many last words are given, if somebody is executed, they'll give an opportunity for them to say one last thing. Nathan Hale, the great American patriot, he was a spy in the Revolution that was caught by the British. And they hanged him on a tree, and before he died, they said, "Okay, you say one more thing and then you're going to die." And he said, "My only regret in this life is that I have only but one life to give for my country." That's what Nathan Hale said. Major John Andre, the British spy who was caught by the Americans, was requested that he be killed by firing squad. But Washington said no. Why? Because Nathan Hale was killed by being hung. And so John Andre said this before he died: "I'll face my fate like a brave man." But Jesus doesn't do any of that. And so Pilate is shocked. Jesus isn't scrambling. Jesus isn't pleading. Why is Jesus not doing this? 2 reasons. He's in control and he knows God's plan. He had a conversation with God the night before in the Garden of Gethsemane, and God made it clear that he was to go through with this. So Jesus is not fighting it. Jesus is submitting and surrendering to God's plan. And verses 4 and 5 are also a fulfillment of Isaiah 53:7. Where in that text, I'm paraphrasing, but it says, "He will not say anything." And I encourage you, since it is Holy Week, I know I've given you a lot of homework as far as reading goes and videos and all that. If you got time, how about this? Just make time. Isaiah 53. Read Isaiah 53 this week. Luke 23, verses 6 through 12 tells us that Pilate washed his hands and sent Jesus to Herod Antipas. But Jesus would not even say a word to him either. The man who killed his cousin John the Baptist doesn't say a word to any of them. Takes it silently. Let me ask you this question. How much better would we all be if we shut our mouths more? I mean, how much better would we be if we just didn't talk as much? And I don't mean that. I'm not saying we need to leave here silently or don't. I'm not saying anything astronomical like that. But what I'm saying is, it would just be a lot better if we just didn't always say what we feel or what we think. When I was younger, I think I might have told you this story, but if I did, just humor me. I'm going to tell you again. My mom loves to tell the story of when I was a child. We would go to the grocery store. And you know, when you're in the grocery store, you want to get in, you want to get out, and you want to make sure that you get your stuff and then get out as soon as possible. Well, my mom would have me in the buggy, and I was around Nathan's age, and I was in the little buggy, and then guess what? I would talk to every single person in the store. Hey, how you doing? Hey. And if somebody wouldn't talk to me, I'd get louder. And so I would do that, and I remember, I will never forget this. We were in the store, and she turned around to me, and she said, not everybody wants to know what's going on in your head. Not everybody has to hear it, right? And I think that's similar to you and I. We all have frustrations. We all have problems. But Jesus gives us an example here that sometimes silence speaks a whole lot louder than words. Look at verses 6 through 15. Secondly, tonight, we've got a substitution here. Yeah, we've got silence first that Jesus gives. But now we've got a substitution. This crowd was large, loud, boisterous. The chief priests had achieved their goal. They got a large amount of people to go against him. And Pilate realizes he's in a pretty bad spot here. John chapter 18, verse 38, Pilate tells the Jewish leaders, he says, hey, I find no grounds for charging him. Pilate is honest with them and says, legally, I can't do it. There's no grounds to charge him of anything. And notice that death is not in their minds at this point. Okay? Killing him is not yet in the picture. They want him arrested. And on top of this, in Matthew 27, verse 19, Pilate's wife has a dream and tells Pilate, hey, I had a dream. I don't feel good about this. You need to have nothing to do with Jesus and get your hands off of this situation. Pilate knows what's right. Pilate is told by his wife, so husbands, we must listen to our wives when they tell us they have a feeling, right? You didn't laugh like I thought you would. And so this is happening, and Pilate knows, because he says, look there at verse 10, he says, for he perceived it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. Pilate knows cognitively that this is not a good idea. He knows that it isn't the right thing to do, and he doesn't have a backbone. In this text, I see Pilate's got an opportunity to do the right thing. Let me give you some insight here. There's always an opportunity to do the right thing. Always. Might not be the most attractive. 9 times out of 10, it's going to be the more painful one, but there's always an opportunity. We need more Christians today who have real backbones, who not only know what's right, but stand for what's right. And so what happens here? Well, Pilate is looking for a way out. Look at verses 6 through 10. Now at the feast he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. So apparently, Pilate had created a habit or tradition that through the years, every Passover, in order to calm them down a little bit, he would release a Jewish prisoner of their choosing. They could choose one Jewish prisoner. It was a tradition to be released to freedom once a year. And they did that to raise morale and to cut down on riots. And so Pilate is going to try to use this as a way out. And it blows up in his face and backfires. So Pilate knows that, hey, I usually release a prisoner, so let's just release this guy. He hasn't really done anything. So let's go ahead and release him. And in verse 11, we're going to see they don't want to do that. But see, all of this was a part of God's plan, part of God's will. And when something is a part of God's plan, it will happen. No matter what you and I do to try to stop it. And so God's sovereignty is all over the situation. And so Mark tells us about this man Barabbas, which is interesting. The name Barabbas in the Greek literally means son of the Father, right? And so that's interesting. Barabbas would have been a local hero to the Jews. During an insurrection, and by the way, there were a lot of insurrections. What does that mean? Many wars between the Jews and the Romans, right? And so we believe that Barabbas, or we know that he killed somebody during an insurrection. Scholars love to argue about which insurrection he was a part of. I got the answer for you. We don't know. So there's not really a point in trying to figure it out. So Barabbas was a part of this. Now, some are going to argue that Barabbas was either part of a murderer from an insurrection. A lot of scholars are going to say, and I kind of agree with them on this, that he was a right-wing Jew, meaning he was like crazy radical and killed somebody, so he gets arrested. Some people think Barabbas was a bandit, and bandit actually has a term in Jewish circles, not like what you and I think of as a bandit, but like somebody that actually lived in the mountainous region in Israel and would come down at night and plunder people's homes. That was the Jewish definition of a bandit. So whether he was a bandit or whether he was, killed someone in the insurrection, we don't really know. But the crowd shouted Barabbas, which makes me think that he was a war hero in their minds, because he had killed a Roman person. So in their minds, he was a hero. And in verse 9, Pilate asks them, he says, hey, don't you want to release the king of the Jews? And so Pilate's plan backfires here. And even when you and I don't understand what God is doing, we don't understand why we're not getting our way, or why our prayers aren't being answered as quickly or in the way that we want them to, you got to remember, he's got a purpose and he's got a plan. You say, man, that's cliche and that's preacher talk. No, that's true. And so Pilate knows why the chief priests are doing this, but he chooses not to do the right thing. Before we look at verses 11 through 15, I need to ask you, do you have a backbone? Or do you constantly and consistently cave into people pleasing? I think we got a lot of pilots walking around. And I'm not talking about the ones that fly planes. If you look at other denominations, there was a day, and it really wasn't that long ago, where Presbyterians, Lutherans, Methodists, and Baptists were very similar. There were minor differences, yes. Now the doctrinal gap is huge. When we all first came to this country, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and the denominations split over doctrinal issues. They split over doctrinal interpretations of things that were actually in the scriptures. And now denominations split over things that are not even in the Bible. When denominations first split in the beginning, it was because, I interpret the verse this way. I interpret it that way. Okay, let's agree to disagree and we'll make our own denomination. Now denominations split because somewhere along the line, whether in the pew or in the pulpit, somebody caved in. Somebody caved in. It started with the Methodists, and if you were formerly Methodist, I don't hate you. I still love you. My great-grandfather was a Methodist preacher. I've got an entire side of my family that's Methodist. I have no problem with people who grew up Methodist. I have a problem with people who let the doctrine of the Bible slide and slip and stumble away. It first started in 1965 with the Methodist Church. They decided that they caved in when it came to women clergy. They said, okay, we're going to do that. The Bible clearly says, no, the role of pastor is for a male, right, overseer. And they said, no, we're going to go the other way. And so they started that. And then, of course, last summer and then summer before that, many Methodist churches have left, and of the United Methodist Church, and they've left because of the homosexual clergy being present. And so everybody says, how in the world could you have a homosexual preacher or whatever the case in the Methodist Church? They missed the mark in 1965, so it was only a matter of time. And that's why we as Southern Baptists, we're in a very conservative spot right now, but we got to stay that way. We are only one generation away from being liberal. I can confidently say this: Baptists are the only denomination in America, for the most part, that are not liberal. That's it. Y'all do realize 100 years ago it wasn't like that. So what happened? Somebody slipped. You say, oh no, he's going on a tangent. No, I'm serious. Pilate didn't have a backbone. He didn't stand up for what was right. And when you and I choose not to stand up for what is right because we're afraid of hurting someone's feelings, or we're afraid of what somebody's going to say, or we're afraid of what somebody's going to think, we start going down that same slippery slope. And look, I've done a lot of things wrong in my life, as you have too. But one thing I've always tried to do, try, not successful all the time. Your yes be yes, your no be no. I've sat in meetings either on associational level, state level, universities and stuff, and I've been on boards and things, and things have come up before that doctrinally go against what I believe, and 99% of the time I'm the youngest one in the room. Big shocker, right? You got people who've been in the ministry a long time, who know the Bible. We'll let that one slide. I don't. I've been asked to resign from boards. I've been asked to go out of the room because I've gotten kind of fiery. Can you imagine that, me getting pumped up? I can't ever see that. But I'm serious. I'm going on this tangent because it is a big concern of mine that if we cave in now, our children are going to suffer. And that is exactly what has happened. I believe for decades, for centuries, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Lutherans, many people came to know Jesus through that, through those denominations. But how many more people are going to come? Maybe not near as many. Why? Because they're not believing the Bible anymore. And we are just one step away from that if we're not careful. If you slip on one thing in the Bible, you will slip on it all. So what happens? It gets out of hand. Look at verses 11 through 15. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd and to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews? And they cried out again, crucify him. We started out with Jesus going to jail. Now things have escalated to the point where they want Jesus dead. And they cried out again, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? But they all shouted the more, crucify him. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, that's where we go wrong. Well, I'm just going to try to make them happy. Let me tell you something. When you try, and I have done this from personal experience, so I can tell you, when you try to make somebody happy, and if you make them happy, the next day they're going to be mad about something else. Speed up the process, make them mad today. That's what I do. I mean, it's unreal. So I walk in somewhere, I got a hat. Oh, you don't need to have that hat on. Is it bothering you? No. I'm not even going down that. I'm leaving that alone. And so Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, gives them Barabbas, right? He messes up. And here's the thing about humanity, is that when we try to satisfy people, that actually takes you down in the long run. But people are never going to be truly happy if they're not rooted in Christ. There's always going to be something wrong. The chief priests caught on to the fact Pilate may try to do something to have Jesus released. The chief priests are like, oh man, Pilate's trying to get out of this. Well, yes, he is. And so they pump up the crowd, they get everybody angry, they get everybody loud. We talked about it Sunday, but these are the bloodthirsty wolves that I was talking about. This is what it festers to. In verse 11, the crowd insists that Barabbas be given to them. Remember tonight that you and I are Barabbas, because it is you and I that should have died on the cross. It is you and I that should have suffered, but Jesus took our place. And in verse 12, Pilate then asked, and what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews? It wasn't Pilate's idea to have Jesus crucified. And so crucifixion was the highest and the most brutal form of physical punishment in the Roman government. It was the worst form that you could go through. Murderers and bandits were crucified, not a man who was just verbally claiming to be king. And so this is where the situation escalates and gets out of hand. And I think this shows you too, things can escalate really, really fast. When situations escalate and get out of hand in your life, I want to encourage you, be a de-escalator and not gas on the fire. Don't be a gas on the fire kind of person. Be a de-escalator. Try to de-escalate a situation. Situations like this are text. They can get out of hand. And Pilate asked why in verse 14, but the crowd gets louder and louder and louder. So Pilate gives in. He's done. He hands over Jesus to them. How much wrongdoing will you commit just to satisfy others? How much wrong are you willing to do? Some people will do it far beyond you can imagine. But see, look where, and I mentioned this already, but look where this has gotten us as a Big C church. God's people. It's gotten us in a terrible spot. Because most of us, if we're honest, we're a lot more similar to Pilate than we are Jesus. We cave in, we have no backbone a lot of the time. Without knowing it, the religious leaders here, Pilate and Barabbas, were all part of God's plan to save us as sinners. Very last thing, and I'll look at it quickly. In verses 16 through 20, I want you to see the striking that happens. The physical beating of Jesus is starting to unravel. Verse 16, and the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters. And they called together the whole battalion, which would have been 600 soldiers. Yeah, I mean, you'd think we'd have a top-rated criminal if 600 soldiers have to come escort him out of there. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And notice, when they put it on him, I don't want you to think that they placed it on his head. They pressed it on his head until they saw blood streaming from the side of his face. And they began to salute him, meaning mocking him, right? Look at verse 18. Hail, King of the Jews. And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him, meaning they were making fun of him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak, put his clothes on him, his own clothes on him, and they led him out and they crucified him. And we'll look at the rest of the crucifixions. Pastor Steve will lead us through that at sunrise to begin with. In verse 15, we're told that Jesus is scourged, and some translations are going to say he was flogged. Let me define what that is for you. A person would be bound to a post or a pillar, and they would be tied to it, and they would literally be beaten on that pole until there was flesh hanging in shreds from their bone. You say, oh, you're being graphic. Yeah, but I want you to understand what it really was like. And so they beat him constantly. And they would use something called a flagellum, which was a tool that consisted of leather thongs, 12 leather thongs that would be plated on it with several pieces of animal bone or lead, and it would form a chain, and they would use a flagellum, and they would hit it, and the whole purpose of a flagellum is once it hits the flesh of the human body, it tears it off with it. That was the purpose of a flagellum. And so Josephus recorded that there were some floggings to where humans were flogged so bad that you could see their organs hanging out of their body while they're still alive. And so Jesus is alone, he is humiliated, he is naked, and he is beaten close to death. And Jesus went through that for you and I. And so that song that Emily just sang is so true. The blood that he poured for you and for me. These verses describe 7 important details of what happened. He's clothed in a purple cloak, probably a faded military garment that they were mocking him with. Secondly, they give him a mark crown made of thorns. Thirdly, they mocked him by saying, Hail, King of the Jews. They spit on him. They insulted him. They knelt down and mocked him and worshiped. They hit him with a stick. Then they let him out. You see the silence the substitution, you see the striking. The Civil War, during the Civil War was happening in the eastern United States, and of course it was North versus South. But there was also something really wild going on in the West, and that's why it's called the Wild West. Okay, I guess that wasn't funny. All right. I am striking out tonight, just like the Atlanta Braves. Okay. It took you a minute. So in the Midwest, there was a group called Quantrell's Raiders. And this was a group of outlaws that were notorious for coming into small towns and villages in the Midwest and the western frontier and robbing people, pillaging people, and burning towns and killing people. And so the Westerns you see, they're not 100% accurate, but there is some validity to it. And so in Kansas, a group of settlers had had enough, and so they call in the state militia, and they get the military involved, and they're going to search, and they're going to find these desperados. The orders were given to the soldiers that once they find these outlaws, that they were to kill them immediately in form of a firing squad. Not too long after the group set out, they captured some of the outlaws in Iowa. And I've been to Iowa, and there's nothing out there. It's just flat as can be. And so they caught them in Iowa, and after they caught them, they had them dig these long trenches, which would become their own graves. So they were sentenced to dig out their own grave. And so they lined all of the outlaws up, and they were beginning to get ready to load their guns to kill these outlaws. And there was a bush nearby, and this little man comes running out of the bush and cries out, "Wait, wait!" And you got to think these guys are blindfolded. These guys are getting ready to die. And Major Whittle was the officer in command that day, and he said, "What do you have to say?" And this man's name who came out from under the bush, his name was Willie Lee. And he said, "Let the man go free. He has a wife, he has babies, and he is needed at home. Let me take his place." And Willie Lee was a young man who did not do anything wrong. And he said, "I'll take a guilty plea. Let me jump in line and take his place." Major Whittle, after a lot of conversation over the matter, decided to let the man that was already in line go free. And the little man who had just popped up from under the bush, Willie Lee, hopped in line, took a blindfold, and was shot. That man was able to go free. Years later, the redeemed man came back to the awful scene where the mass execution occurred. He dug in the ground and found Willie Lee's body. Bones at this point. He took his friend's body, he put the body on a mule, and he took it back to Kansas, and he gave him a proper burial there. To this day, in Kansas City, there's a 15-foot marble monument with these words inscribed in it. "Sacred to the memory of Willie Lee, he took my place in the line. He died for me." This evening we've studied a scripture text that explains how a convicted murderer was set free. Barabbas was set free because Jesus took his place. And I want to tell you tonight, every person in here is a convicted sinner. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. I'm not saying you're a murderer. I'm not saying that you're any type of criminal, but you are a sinner. And whether you're a murderer or you've told a lie, let me let you in on a little secret. Yes, they might have different consequences, but they are equal in the eyes of the Lord. Sin is sin. And so you are a convicted sinner. And due to our sin, and we really don't comprehend this, but every single person here tonight, you should have had to die on the cross. You should have had to have been crucified. I saw some of your faces a moment ago where I explained what Jesus went through in the crucifixion, how gory it was. Can you imagine going through that? And so Jesus did this for you. And so we're in the middle of Holy Week. And there's probably a lot of other things that are on your mind. But can you slow down for 5 minutes? And Miss Rhonda, you come and play. And can you reflect on what God did for you and what Jesus did for you? That while he was being yelled at and screamed at, and Pilate looks at him and says, aren't you going to say anything? Jesus said nothing. Why? Because he wanted to die for you. He wanted to take your place. Willie Lee wanted that man in the line on the firing squad to go home and be a dad. Jesus died for you so that you can live for him. Jesus died for you so that you can tell more people about him. He died for you so that you can have a good life right here and right now. And you need to praise him and you need to thank him, and you don't have to wait till Holy Week. You should do it all year round. But especially this week when we have the opportunity to reflect on what he's done. He took your space. He hopped on the cross for you. And if you don't know him, you can know him today. Willie Lee hopped in line, no questions asked. Hopped out from under a bush in Iowa. I don't even know if they have bushes there. I guess they do. But tonight, it's my prayer. You realize we're Barabbas. You're a convicted sinner. And so I want to encourage you, if you've got some sin, there's no sin too big for God. And I want to encourage you tonight, spend some time with the Lord. Thank him for your salvation if you're saved. If you're not saved, I invite you to come and grab my hand or grab Pastor Steve's hand or grab somebody. Say, hey, I want to know Jesus. He took my place. He took your place. And that's what we celebrate. It's not about the bunny. It's not about all the food that you're going to make on Saturday. Although we do enjoy it, Eddie. Thank you. It's about the fact that Jesus took our place. Do we really understand that we were supposed to be on the cross? We were supposed to experience that. But he died for you. He died for me. Like Willie Lee, he hopped in the